certain messages and so on. Just tell the truth. And this is what the intelligence analysts really, really tried to do, to be honest in their appreciations and to say when they don't know.
What are the risks that concern you the most around the world?
That advanced technology is getting into the hands of people who can use it to enrich themselves or use it to harm other people.
But actually facilitate discussion and facilitate debate. And that's how we come up with the best possible decisions. But it's not easy. And despite having many great business leaders, a lot of them really struggle with that, I think. Today's guest is Professor Sir David Omand. He's the visiting professor in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and he's held senior positions across UK security, intelligence and defence institutions, including as director of the UK's Government Communications Headquarters, many of you will know as GCHQ. He was the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office and the first UK Security and Intelligence Coordinator at the Cabinet Office. He served for 7 years on the UK Joint Intelligence Committee. He writes widely on intelligence, on counterterrorism, resilience, and on the ethics of secret intelligence. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast. Now, if you lead a business, a public agency, or really any organisation that can't afford surprises, this episode really is a masterclass in decision-making and uncertainty, how to spot signals, avoid strategic surprises, build resilience, and also give you an understanding of the UK's contest strategy, the national risk management system designed to keep society functioning freely and with confidence at the same time. So, David, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Hi.
Whereabouts in the world do we find you today, David?
North London.
Beautiful spot, especially in spring. Is it too early to say spring, or have we reached spring in London?
No. The sun is shining. It's a beautiful day outside. The daffodils are just coming out.
Fantastic. You should work in tourism as well. That sounded very appealing. Well, David, you've written several great books, including How Spies Think, 10 Lessons in Intelligence. Now, in my experience, intelligence is not necessarily about delivering certainty to decision makers, but more about reducing uncertainty. And that requires us to not assume that everyone thinks like us. And we've seen that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We've seen that time and time again in geopolitics over the last decade. But it also requires us to ensure that we have habits. And I think that's really important, that they're habits or systems that ensure that we're continually testing assumptions, that we remain curious to continually test data and analyze incomplete information. Can you tell us what made you write this book? And since you've written this book, what parts of it do you think have had the most impact on your readers?
I wrote it because I've had a lot of experience, either part of the intelligence community or a customer for the product of the British intelligence community. And I felt there was a place for a book that was accessible to the ordinary reader, that would sort of demystify James Bondery. On the other hand, the sort of assumption that intelligence analysts can somehow predict the future. Nobody can predict the future. There are no crystal balls, even in the Joint Intelligence Committee. We don't sit round a table looking at a crystal ball. But good analysis, the purpose of intelligence, is to enable better decisions to be taken by reducing ignorance about what we might face. And nowadays, most of that information is open source if you know where to look, if you put the effort in. But there's a tiny little bit of it, which is called secret intelligence, which is information other people, your adversaries, people who mean you harm, don't want you to have, and they may go to extremely violent lengths to prevent you getting. That's what secret intelligence agencies are there for, is to provide that extra information that will hopefully reduce the risk that these adversaries pose.
Now, you've seen real warning failures during your career, and when intelligence gets it wrong, it's really easy to blame. But I wonder, if we look at what's the actual root cause of that, is it collection gaps? Is it the analysis? Is it our intrinsic biases? And we speak about that a lot on the podcast.
It's all of those in different combinations, in different circumstances. And clearly, if something goes wrong, if a terrorist gets through our defenses, if a bomb goes off or there's a knife attack, by definition, it's an intelligence failure because we didn't stop it. Despite the fact that I think it's, if I remember right, since March 2017, 43 late stage plots, terrorist plots, were actually stopped by MI5 and the police. But some got through. I have in my mind a sort of simple-minded comparison with road traffic. You try to drive sensibly and carefully. There are times, taking somebody in an emergency to the casualty department where you might have your foot down on the accelerator. But if there is an accident, are you guilty of careless driving? Are you guilty of reckless driving, where you knew perfectly well you should have been doing certain things, but you deliberately didn't, or you got into the vehicle with alcohol in your system? That's reckless, and that's culpable. So when you look at an intelligence failure, you have to ask, where, in good faith, people trying to do their best, did the system let them down? Did the previous generation let them down by not setting up the kind of collection that would give the information that would have helped? Or is it just chance? Is it just there's a term, normal accidents, which I think is a very useful one from the Charles Perrow's book on the 3 Mile Island near meltdown, where he said any sufficiently complicated bureaucratic or technical system occasionally will break. And you'll get unusual combinations of this goes wrong, and then this goes wrong, and then that goes wrong. Result, failure. And one of the ways you deal with that is buffering, so that any one of those things going wrong doesn't mean that the whole system is going to end up in some sort of disaster. So I just think that before we throw around terms like intelligence failure, you need to think about, at the time, what was known, not what we know now, of course, because with the passage of time, it becomes very clear. One example I can think of was one of the 7/7 bombers, the bombers who attacked the London Underground, who was on MI5's radar. And they were engaged in a surveillance operation of somebody else, another quite serious suspect. And that serious suspect met somebody. The watchers could see this, but they didn't know who it was. Now, the question was tactical question. Do you continue to follow the original target that you were told to follow, or do you stop that and go and follow the new contact? For all you know, they may just have been exchanging the addresses of a pizza parlor. You don't know, and you can't know, but then, sadly, long afterwards, you discover that that other individual actually might have been the starting clue that could have led to the frustration of a terrorist attack. You'll never know at the time.
It's very, very difficult. When we do debriefs after crisis with our corporate clients and with different government actors, one of the things I always have to really emphasize is not based on the information we have today, 2 weeks after we've resolved the crisis, but at that time, at 11:34, when the crisis management team decided to pause operations, close factories, send staff, pay the ransomware, based on the information you had at that time, and only the information at that time, was that the most reasonable decision? Not based on the information you have now. Hindsight's very easy. But that's something I think we have difficulty doing. We go, but it was the wrong decision. Yeah, it's the wrong decision with the information we have now, but not with the information that you reasonably had at that time.
I think the word reasonable that you use is the key to it. Would a reasonable person, well trained in whatever it is, have taken that decision? And very often, this occurs all the time in a military context, where potentially if a junior officer is leading some patrol, he turns left thinking that that's the safer route. It turns out they get ambushed. Now, you don't hang that young officer out to dry. Yes, with hindsight, you can see it's a mistake. But then when you start to investigate, if you discovered that actually there was intelligence that showed that was not a good move to make, but it never got to the young officer, then you can begin to dig into the system and potential systemic problems which might need fixing.
No, I think that's a great point, David. And one of the things you talked about was if previous generations have set us up for failure. And I wonder, there's this assumption sometimes that intelligence cycles fail because of a scarcity of information. But in 2026, I think there's a real problem around contamination of information, deception, manipulation are really at an industrial scale. Now, they're not new. Deception, Napoleon was using deception, the Romans were using deception, but how they're used today, from state disinformation to deep fakes, synthetic media, and of course, the amplification that artificial intelligence brings. So I wonder if you were advising companies or policymakers today, what can be done with the intelligence cycle so that it stays resilient in a world where there's just so much white noise, and not just white noise, but deliberate misinformation?
Can one say, take care? Put to the back of your mind what you want to see in the information and actually start to look critically at what it does tell you. This is where deceptions work, because usually they're telling the customer or the chief executive or the government what it is secretly they want to see. That was the case with the Iraq War. That was the case of biological warfare, the mobile BW trailers that Saddam was alleged to have. That intelligence came from a defector who was debriefed and interrogated by the German Secret Service. And they passed the information on to the United States and to us. And it was very credible because this guy had worked on Saddam's BW programs first time around. The problem was he faked a lot of the information he passed on because he wanted Saddam overthrown. He wanted to encourage the American intervention. And as you can imagine, when this landed in the Pentagon, this confirmed all the fears. It was the intelligence they wanted to see. And a point that's allied to that is that even when the information you're looking at doesn't quite fit, or it might be internally contradictory, or you have other reports that didn't point in that direction, the natural human temptation is to argue away the inconsistencies. I've seen that happen time and time again because it's a sort of confirmation bias. You want this information to be true. It isn't quite fitting the way it should. So what are the reasons why it isn't? And it's the same with the scientist conducting an experiment, and there are one or two points that don't lie on the straight line on the graph. Do you blame the equipment and say, gosh, we obviously take those points out, we'll just scrub them from the data? Or do you say, no, actually, well, this is the beginning of scientific discovery. There's something going on here we hadn't realized. And so often, that's the clue to some great innovation.
Yeah, definitely. And that's certainly one of the things we work with crisis management teams on. The most important thing I think a crisis management chair can do is not make decisions, but actually facilitate discussion and facilitate debate. And that's how we come up with the best possible decisions. But it's not easy. And despite having many great business leaders, a lot of them really struggle with that, I think.
It's never easy. Part of my definition of a crisis is that the person at the top, the CEO or the chair or the minister, doesn't know what to do. If they did know what to do, you pull the plans out of the cupboard, you ring up the emergency services, you assemble a sort of team to manage the emergency. But in a crisis, by definition, it's very novel, or a series of things have hit you. It doesn't seem to fit previous patterns, what I call the rubber levers test. You pull on the lever and it doesn't seem to be connected to action on the ground. I think good leaders at this point recognize that and realize that they've actually got to pull in their own team. They've got to pull in outside expertise, mobilize so that they find a path through the crisis. And it may well be quite a novel path. It's not something they've practiced or rehearsed. This is a paradox. The more determined the chief executive, the more experienced they are, the more threatening it is to be in a situation where you don't know what to do.
I think, David, I'd love to hear you. You mentioned the rubber levers test, and you also mentioned in your writing the arc of crisis model. I think I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think they're great concepts around the moment the controls stop working as expected, and this typical arc of a crisis from first signs to confusion and then moving on to clarification. Can you talk us through those two concepts? I think they're so valuable.
I have this trilogy of the emergencies, crises, and disasters, and I put crises in the middle. because you don't manage crises, they manage you. And that's the point about the chief executive won't actually know straight off what to do. If he thinks he does, he may well be seriously misguided. So you have to mobilize, get resources around, say to the team, together we will find a way through this, rather than the top down, I'm the boss, I know what I'm doing. And as I say, it can be quite threatening in those circumstances for the person at the top to be in that situation. So you're probably going to, in this arc of crisis, something happens, it comes to notice. If the windows have been blown in by a terrorist explosion outside, or the basement IT is flooded, it's pretty obvious something serious has happened. But it might not be like that. It might be that the problem has been cooking away quietly for some years, ignored by the C-suite. Yes, the numbers were falling in this particular region, and they kept falling, and they're still falling. And then suddenly you've got a crisis, and the market has suddenly woken up to this, and you have to do something about it. So that's a first stage. Then, of course, you've got your team together, you've mobilized. It's harder to do that than you would think, because the message going out to the company is forget about what we were saying before about the priorities. Now there is a real and present danger in front of us, and that's what we've got to crack fairly quickly before it turns into a disaster for us. So that message can only come from the top. Hate to say it, but the fact that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson missed the first 4 or 5 emergency meetings on COVID sent the wrong signal. This is a health emergency. The Secretary of State for Health can share that. But it wasn't a health emergency. It was a national emergency, an economic emergency, as we very quickly discovered. So that message from the top has got to be clear. We're going to mobilize. We'll find a way through this. Then I hope you get to the sort of consolidation stage where you've worked out your path. You've still got to be prepared to take account of further information or indeed further manifestations of crisis. Things hit you, and then they hit you again, and then they hit you again. So you can't just make a plan and then that's it. It's all over. And then you get through this consolidation phase, I hope, to a sort of clearing up phase. But one should never forget there's a sort of hidden final phase, which is the calling to account and, if necessary, retribution phase. If people are dead, there are going to be inquests. If a company has really lost value, shareholders are going to demand heads on a plate. So in the course of managing the crisis, a little bit of space has to be kept for thinking ahead to how all this is going to play out.
I think that last stage that you labelled retribution, I think in the corporate world we often call it more lessons learned and strengthening systems. But yes, I find that actually the most difficult stage, because I think last year I worked with 25 different companies on crisis, and I think one actually was willing to go through that final step. All the others are keen just to get back to business, put it behind them and just move on, which is, I think, just such a lost opportunity to strengthen systems and to be stronger for the next crisis, which is coming.
It's related to a point that I make in my book about building up a reputation, not just in media, but in the public mind, the customer mind, the investor mind, for reliability, telling the truth, being open, as transparent as you can within the obvious sort of commercial confines. That stands you in good stead when something bad happens, because you will be given a little bit of slack. Otherwise, if the reputation, and one could think of the BP in the Macondo oil spill case, if you've had problems before with an oil refinery fire, you've had problems before with oil spills in Alaska, the reaction from the media may be far more skeptical than it needs to be. And the same is true of governments. If you build up a reputation when things are quiet, which it will stand you in good stead when suddenly something unexpected happens. If you get it wrong, of course, then you'll pay quite a price if people simply don't believe the explanation you're trying to give as to why the company is in this difficulty or that difficulty.
I made a very similar point to a crisis communications team. So the communications team is a subset of a larger crisis management team for a very large multinational company about a week ago. And one of the things I said to them is, your response to this crisis actually needed to start 6 months before the crisis. You need to have those strong relationships with the media, with your stakeholders, with the investors. If you're only starting to build that now that the crisis has occurred, you're about 6 months behind the ball. This is something you have to be.
That is so true. That is so true. And there are steps you can take to build that relationship, to give media access to facilities, and so they understand more about what the company is about. And the same is true of investors. If it all suddenly hits them as a terrible shock, and there's a level of mistrust because there's been lack of transparency about the accounts, for example, and exactly how some complex company was working, you run into a problem. It's so much harder to do something about it. So the other part of that is, well, it's obvious. Do not try to spin yourself out of a crisis, because the first things you say may well turn out to be untrue as more information comes in. And these days, particularly with social media, people are so quick to spot inconsistencies between what the regional manager was saying, what head office is saying, all of that. So taking genuine care. I have a slight hobby horse here about giving apologies when things go wrong, even if in the end it's not your fault. A lot of difficulties could have been avoided if public authorities had stood up and said, we're sorry, something happened on our watch, people got hurt, lessons will be learned, we'll put things as right as we possibly can, but we're sorry. If the corporate lawyers get involved, they will say, well, that's an admission of guilt. When the court cases arrive, you'll regret having said that. I don't think that's true at all. And I think courts really understand when a chief executive or a government minister stands up and says, we're sorry, I'm sorry that on my watch this happened. And that goes a long way, I think, to assuaging the feelings of next of kin, for example, that somehow those in charge have been trying to avoid taking responsibility.
Yeah, as an advisor to executive teams and boards, I'm often at their companies when they're making significant announcements, often announcements that are not pleasant for the employees. And I always make a point, I'm actually normally not staring at the chair of the board or the CEO during that announcement. I often position myself near the front of the room and I'm staring back at the employees and I'm looking at their nodding, their faces and saying, are they accepting this as the truth? Is this a truth to them? And are they understanding? Or is there resistance? Is there shaking of the head? Is there whispering to each other? And I think that's much more important to me as someone who's advising the leadership team is, do the employees believe you? Do they think it's genuine? Do they appreciate it? And are they going to be a positive force working with you to find a solution? Or have you already got them offside? Are they already going to be resisting against you? And David, as well as being an accomplished author, you're also the architect of the UK's counterterrorism strategy contest. Now, for our listeners, perhaps you can explain why was this strategy necessary? What were you trying to achieve when you designed the contest strategy?
9/11 was an enormous shock globally, and it was a shock to the United Kingdom too. We lost more Brits in New York than any previous or since terrorist incident because there were so many working in the Twin Towers. I arrived on the scene in September 2002. So some time had passed, there'd been the intervention in Afghanistan, but the threat was very clearly still there. So I sent a note out to, if you like, Whitehall, and everyone I could think of, saying, I think we actually ought to have a national counterterrorism strategy. I asked for volunteers, let's put a team together. And this is the military, the Foreign Office, civil departments, local governments, central government, you name it, lots of people involved, and the police. So I sent this minute out saying we ought to construct this strategy and then present it to the cabinet, British cabinet, to see whether that's, as it were, the way they want to proceed in a world of very significant threat. Contest was a name I dreamt up in the bath, literally lying there, taking the phrase counterterrorism strategy and picking letters in sequence. And if you try it, you can make quite a lot of words that way. Contest seemed to me to have the right kind of resonance, if you like. My experience in defense had been that basically if you can't get it on the front of a T-shirt, and it hasn't got a fairly resonant code name, it will just be one of those glossy documents that goes in a cupboard. It's never looked at again. If you want a counterterrorism strategy that actually people use and that lives, then you have to have that kind of, if you like, simplification. So I sent this out. We put a team together. Prime Minister allowed me to chair an official committee, cabinet committee. We did a lot of work for a couple of months, and then early 2003, I presented the results to the cabinet, and they accepted it. The underlying logic of the British position at that point was we want to defeat the terrorists by denying them what they seek. And what they seek is fear, disruption. If we can maintain conditions of normality, then we're prevailing and the terrorists are losing. I may say that at the same time, the United States had declared war on al-Qaeda. And the first sentence of the US strategy was, America is at war. British ministers did not think the United Kingdom was at war. So we needed a different approach. So it hinges around this idea of normality. Can you reduce the risk, not eliminate it? Because if you try to eliminate something like terrorism, then you're liable to be drawn into measures which in the long run, detention without trial, for example, will not achieve your purpose. So you're going to reduce the risk from terrorism to the point at which people feel sufficiently secure to go about their normal business. I added at the end of the statement of aim, which we framed, two words, freely and with confidence. Freely, meaning a message to ministers, you will not have succeeded in this objective if you've had to suspend our cherished rights and freedoms in the course of doing it. And with confidence is the touchstone. Do people still travel on holiday on aeroplanes? Do people use the London Underground even after it's been bombed? Is there inward investment? Do opinion polls show that people are not in fear? So that was the approach that led us to a strategic aim of content. It hasn't really changed from the one I presented to Cabinet early in 2003, and that's over 20 years. So we've stuck to the same approach, the same logic for over 20 years. That's hugely important because some of the things you need to do take a very long time. Giving all the emergency services interoperable radios, for example, very expensive, takes a long time. So that sort of continuity really helps. And underneath it, of course, you have to turn that noble sounding objective into things to do, things to spend money on, measures to take. And that's where I quite shamelessly stole from the City of London the risk equation. Expected value it's your likelihood of the bad things happening, your vulnerability to that kind of bad thing, and then what happens if they get through our defences and do it, the impact, both in the short term, clearing up and dealing with casualties, and in the long term, for how long is society going to be disturbed, given, as I said, that the objective is normality. So how quickly can you get back? Now, you can operate on all those variables. And I certainly still believe that the best, most effective counterterrorism strategies have a bit of all of them. And you don't put all your money on catching terrorists, because as we know, tragically, some will get through the net. You don't put all your money on pouring concrete and putting up barbed wire and so on, because you will miss, and so on and so on. So you need that sort of balance between the elements. It will shift over time. We, I think, tripled the size of our security service as a result of this strategy, in order that the first part of the program, which we call Pursue, and worked with some quite unusual countries overseas, as well as our usual allies, to exchange information, uncover networks, use advanced technology, bulk access to metadata and so on, in order to, and that's been hugely successful. The number of trials that have resulted in conviction, successful trials, is extraordinarily high because the evidence in the end was so good. There's a point worth making about the protection side of all of this. Does the public feel protected? Where we came up with this security by design concept. Because if it's normality, you don't want armed policemen on every street corner. You don't want lots of barbed wire and barriers and so on. What you want is conditions of normality. You can design those in so that the average punter isn't aware that actually they are being protected. So if you walk down Whitehall, the main thoroughfare in the centre of London where the government is, you will find at the edge of the pavement there are some what look like stone balustrades of 18th century almost. They're actually designed specially by the security service. They won't fracture into shards of concrete if a car bomb explodes, and they keep the car bomb away from the building. But you don't know that. Another very good example was the London Olympics of 2012, where if you go to the Olympic Park, you see water being used as a barrier. So you try to drive your car with the bomb attached, you sink to the bottom. And that's the approach the United States has taken with its new embassy in London, which has, in old-fashioned terms, you might call a moat around it. But it looks fine, and it adds to the general feeling of normality, rather than having 12-foot high walls with spikes on the top. So these are just examples of the way in which you can make society accentuate that sense of normality, but actually reduce the risk.
I'm a big fan of moats. I was in Damascus a couple of weeks ago, and one of the hotels that I was visiting and assessing actually had a moat around it, and it was fantastic. It meant they didn't need fences on that side because there was this extremely deep moat around it, and it looked beautiful. I wonder, you comment about not eliminating terrorism. I think is a really valuable one, and considering how contest is more of a risk management framework, I wonder how do we balance, and how did you during your time, and maybe how you've seen that evolve since? How do you balance the prevent, the pursue, the protect, and the prepare, especially when it comes to budgets that are limited?
I don't think there's any great science involved. It's about applying experience, trying to spot where there may be gaps, keeping an eye on the technologies used by the adversary, where you may suddenly need to, we're going to have to spend more on this rather than that. For example, there was a period in which we spent a lot of money with private industry developing those X-ray machines for airports. Thankfully, the technology has moved on, and they're much, much more effective than they were initially. So you at one stage, I started to work on this in terms of games theory, minimax and maxi-min, and said to the team, you've got to come up with ideas which minimize the maximum harm a determined adversary could do. In the case of the United Kingdom, Sellafield contains a large amount of highly enriched uranium and plutonium. So that's a clear danger. So a large amount of money was spent making it impregnable, and it's under international inspection as well. I'd be very confident in saying no terrorist is going to break in and carry off nuclear materials. But you can't afford to do that for everything. So the other is minimax, which is minimizing the maximum level of assurance you can give the public. So at train stations, you can't have airport-type screening. There are just too many people going through. We did actually try that once. We ran a trial, but people are in such a hurry in the morning that it would never have worked. So what can you do? Well, you can put in more closed-circuit television cameras and have them monitored, including with the latest artificial intelligence support. You can have more armed police available at very short notice. So even if something does happen, it can be stamped on really very quickly. And the experience in London, for example, the London Bridge attack, where the police are on the scene, armed police are on the scene within minutes of the first call. And what could have been an extremely dangerous situation, yes, it was dangerous, people were hurt, but nonetheless, that kind of preparation reduces the overall risk. I might just make a point about risk here, because we had two kinds of risk in our minds. One is the risk that anyone, say in London, I walk out, what is the risk that I am going to be involved in a terrorist incident? It's minuscule. If I were foolish enough to ride a bicycle in London, my risk would be an order of magnitude greater. If, like some kids I see, I rode my bicycle without a helmet, then forget terrorist risk. You're taking on yourself an extraordinary level of risk. So it is still the case, although the threat of a terrorist attack is substantial, according to the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre, which means an attack is quite likely, the chances that you personally are going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time is low. But what we worried about was what I call societal risk, where it would only take one or two successful attacks to provoke a reaction, perhaps from the extreme right wing. Then you would find, say, a mosque would be torched, communities would come out to defend their territory, defend their religious sites. You would get a riot, perhaps a street march would turn into a riot. Somebody would get their head broken. You have the first martyr. That's how the Northern Ireland conflict started back in 1969, the Battle of Burntollet Bridge, where civil rights marchers were set upon by ultra-loyalist thugs. And it all spiraled from there until we lost control of the streets and you had fighting in the streets. The idea that social harmony, which I'm proud of in the UK, we are a very peaceful place for the most part, could really be disrupted by terrorism, where the terrorists would deliberately seek out disruptive things to do and would incite the counter-reaction. And of course, one of the reasons why terrorists they want to commit some atrocity is that they know this will inflame the public and probably lead to overreaction by the government. And then they can point and say, well, we told you so. We told you this government was fascistic or whatever it might be. Look at what they've just done. So that idea of my idea of normality is very much bound up with this idea of social harmony. People, different communities are just living together in peace.
I think that's really, really important. And I wonder, just briefly, David, when we look at a successful counterterrorism strategy or any really security or policing strategy, it results in nothing. Sometimes, of course, it can result in increased arrests, it can increase in detention, and etc. But generally speaking, if it's working well, there isn't a terrorist attack. How do we measure success? How difficult is it, and how difficult was it for you to justify the budgets and the people and the effort to work on this when you were being effective?
When we started, there was really no difficulty in getting the budget. And Gordon Brown was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was very supportive because he could see the longer term, including the economic consequences of being seen to be an unsafe country. There isn't, I think, I've never come across an objective measure of success because it's about counterfactuals. What would have happened if you hadn't had the strategy, if you hadn't spent the money, if you hadn't poured the concrete? So that kind of comparison can't be done on a spreadsheet. One of the things you can do is track the adversary. So, for example, hijacking has been almost entirely eliminated for the simple reason that every civil airliner on the planet has to have a lockable steel door to the cockpit. And even if there's mayhem going on in the cabin, the pilot don't unlock the door, just land as quickly as you can. And that is, I say, virtually ruled out. It was one of our most successful measures, involved the North American authorities and the European air traffic control authorities saying, we will not let an airliner from any of these little airlines across our territory unless they've got the lockable steel door. And eventually IARC and so on mandated this. And that's a good example where you can really see you've made a difference. Of course, what then happens, coming back to my point, is the terrorists then say, well, right, well, we'll have to smuggle a bomb on board and blow it up. And you get things like al-Awlaki's parcel bomb put on a freight flight. You've got the Detroit underpants bomber, trying to detonate a bomb that he had secreted around his private parts. The bomb went off, but it didn't bring down the aeroplane and did him a certain amount of damage. The adversary will respond. It's one of the big differences between emergency management against natural disasters, floods, fires, and so on, where God doesn't fight back. The adversary will adapt. And the main way we see that in the United Kingdom is they are not at present, as far as I know, trying complex plots like 9/11 or the airlines plot to down simultaneously airliners in the Atlantic. It's the individual with a knife strapped to their wrist or renting a car and running it into a crowd. So that shift, which is in many ways a good shift, the threat is not as sophisticated as it might otherwise. The risk of mass casualties is much less. but much, much harder for the authorities to detect the individual who may switch from, if you like, passive support, get enraged by something seen on social media, circumstances, in what we're seeing today in the Gulf, and decide I must do something, and goes out and does it. That's extremely difficult to preempt.
And of course, David, many of our listeners work in business or even in public policy, not necessarily in secret agencies. If you had to pick one of the lessons that either you've written about, learnt about, spoken about during your career, and our listeners could start applying it tomorrow to improve their analysis, to improve their decision-making processes, what would that one thing be, and what would it look like in practice?
Ooh, well, I feel you're putting me on the spot here, so I will be provocative. My one lesson would be tell the truth to each other. Forget the office politics, forget the spin, forget the media outside that may be wanting certain messages and so on. Just tell the truth. And this is what the intelligence analysts really, really try to do, to be honest in their appreciations and to say when they don't know. And when it comes to surviving crises, if the boss has actually created a climate where the people won't reveal problems because they feel it, the boss is going to lash out at them. So they keep it quiet. They try to solve the problems themselves. They fail. Before you know where you are, it has become a C-suite issue. If only they'd known 2 months earlier, it could have been sorted with minimal damage to the company. And there are so many instances where, for understandable reasons, we're not as honest.
And David, just in the last 30 seconds, I wonder, when you look around the world today in March 2026, what are the risks that concern you the most around the world?
Let's put to one side the really big things: climate change, mass migrations, Carrington events, solar particles. We know all of that. What I'm more worried about is the way that advanced technology is getting into the hands of people who can use it to enrich themselves or use it to harm other people. The AIs of today, the large language models, can do their own coding. You don't have to be an IT expert to be able to hold a company to ransom. And we'll see the advent of quantum computing render most of the systems that most companies are using will not stand up when a quantum computer at scale becomes available. Nor will they be able to contact their customers or their suppliers, because some of them will have upgraded to post-quantum cryptography and others won't, so the messages will bounce back. I mean, it could be chaos. It's just one of those little things that you just need to keep an eye on if you're running an organization. But it is not rocket science. It's all what needs to be done is known. It just needs a little bit of the care and attention to make sure it does happen. But the really, really big risks, are, I think, the existential risks are climate change. And, if President Xi decided to put a blockade around Taiwan, the consequences are, it's very difficult to calculate what would then happen, but it wouldn't be good.
No, thanks for unpacking that, David. And for anyone that is interested to learn more about quantum computing and the impact and the potential risks, we did do an episode on that late 2025. So I think that's worth going back and having a look at. But David, thank you very much for coming on the podcast today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
It's been fascinating. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was a great conversation with Professor Sir David Omand. He's the visiting professor at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. And I really appreciated hearing his thoughts on crisis management, as well as the UK government's counterterrorism policy contest. Please remember, if you prefer to watch your podcast, you can find us on YouTube. Please do go there and remember to subscribe and hopefully like our content. Today's episode was produced and coordinated by Edward Penrose. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.